The assembly never met again. Now both sides of this bitter division of the band of brothers were arming openly, and as openly making ready for the struggle for power. Lenin was still away, but his momentum had persuaded the Marxists of the town and the peasants from the disintegrating army to opt no longer for Kerensky and the Allies, but for Lenin and the end of war. The Tsarist officers, faced with this dilemma, were torn with uncertainties. Yet life went on. In some bizarre way, the social scene of the Russian capital continued to function for the phantoms of the old regime. Right to the end, the agreeable civilities of old St. Petersburg lingered on in their vanishing world. Lenin returned, and the party's object was proclaimed: civil war. Now, in October 1917, the thing that had been a generation in gestation burst forth, the 10 days that shook the world. The cruiser Aurora was ordered out to sea, and refused to go. Street by street and building by building, the Bolsheviks took over. Only the Winter Palace was holding out. The Aurora opened fire, and it surrendered. And out of all this sound and fury, victory came with practically no one getting hurt. In the Winter Palace it came true at last. Lenin handed over all power to the Soviets. For the first time, Bolshevik meant what it said, the majority. In an oddly pedantic phrase, Vladimir Lenin told the nation, "We shall now proceed to construct the socialist order." But only now did the real problems begin. Now, for the Bolsheviks and for Vladimir Lenin, began the real struggle. As he dedicated the memorial to Karl Marx and Engels, Lenin knew this with a dire certainty. The bread ration was down to 2 ounces a day. There was no fuel for the factories. Lenin could, and did, ordain instant socialism, abolishing private enterprise, nationalizing banks and industry, annulling state debts. But he knew that the October victory had not abolished the forces of opposition. He foresaw, rightly, the coming civil war. But first he had to get out of the Great War, the World War. That was Trotsky's job. And at Brest-Litovsk it was done. Russia had lost almost a third of her population, a quarter of her land, half her industry. The capital of Soviet Russia was moved to Moscow, miles inland, less vulnerable, less identified with the vanished court. Behind the Kremlin walls, Vladimir Ilyich Lenin set up a seat of state authority. His personal apartments were ordinary to the point of starkness. He was, after all, used to austerity, quite careless of all possessions. Lenin at home with his wife Krupskaya, the childless pair whose only offspring was an abstraction, a revolution. So enduring is the legend of perpetual motion, it's hard to believe it could ever be tempered by a cat. Not every Russian may have shared this euphoria. Many who had shared in no revolution. On the contrary, the officials and merchants who had opposed it, they too were set to work in the job of reconstruction. And they had no choice. The Civil War was on the way. Lenin, reviewing the nucleus of the new Red Army, could only guess at what it might face at any moment. The one thing he needed was time and peace and opportunity to gain experience and consolidate, and that he did not get. The outside world now fell upon the confusions of the Soviet state. The Germans marched on the Ukraine and ravaged it to protect it, as they loudly claimed, from the revolution. The British landed their Marines at Archangel, more than 10,000 in a few months. They occupied it, overthrew the local Soviet, and marched on. In the Far East, there came the Japanese, 70,000 of them, followed by 9,000 Americans. Against all this, the raw and improvised Red Army. At first, it was only about 150,000 strong. Most of them already had 3 years of the Tsar's war behind them. They could have done without another. Now they had to contend with the world, it seemed, on a front of 5,000 miles. They were short of everything: uniform, guns, food. Their great hope was that they would grow with partisans along the way. The Soviets were beaten back all over Russia. To check this was the task of Trotsky. His work was desperate, fantastic, but we will look in vain for a word of praise in the Soviet records of today. All Russia was now an armed camp. This was, in effect, one world against another, the first confrontation of communism versus the rest. No one in those bloody days had a monopoly of cruelty or fear. At this time, there came an act that seemed curiously incidental. On July the 16th, 1918, the Tsar and his family were shot dead. The dynasty of the Romanovs was wiped off the face of the earth. In any case, death was everywhere. In August, it reached out for Lenin. As he left a Moscow meeting, a woman called Kaplan fired 2 shots. They hit him in the chest and shoulder. He nearly died, protesting, "Why should they make me suffer so?" But that was not his time to die. He recovered quickly. By the spring of 1919, the counter-revolutionaries and the interventionists had taken 6/7 of Russia from the communists. Moscow was under siege. So much hope was resting on the coming European revolution, and a leader of the Hungarian communist movement was welcomed as its envoy. When the workers everywhere had thrown off their chains, Russia would surge forward at their head. But was it when or if? All over Russia, then, the huge morale-building campaign grew. Here was the heyday of desperate oratory, the frantic argument that things could not be as fateful as they seemed. All the major figures of the party said so, endlessly, in a mounting desperation. Sverdlov, Kalinin, Molotov, Ordzhonikidze, Stalin, all in their different ways insisted on the same thing. After all these awful years, must we lose now? Slowly it began to work. The recruits poured in. The partisan forces built up. They multiplied in their thousands, and they died in their thousands too. And slowly their growth came to exceed their extinction. Lenin spared nothing and nobody. He urged and demanded and insisted. He was without pity for anyone, including himself. It took 3 years. The counter-revolution had collapsed, the interventionists were dispersed, and Soviet Russia was at last, and for the first time, on its own.